Ivan Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 1, Part 4.1, Collectivization, read by Natalia Buzova. So much has already been written and said about collectivization. It has been praised on the one hand and condemned and cursed on the other, that it is difficult to add something new, but it is worth recollecting. Collectivization began with party resolutions. They were published in newspapers and were supplemented locally by various rumors and superstitions. Then, one by one, there were the village meetings raised by district officials began. We, the village of Yashniki, Poltava region, met Struev, Kukolnitsky, Harmash. They called for unification, convincing the peasants of the advantages of collective farming over individual farming. But people did not believe the city speakers, since there had already been attempts of communism, and they ended, as a rule, with the fact that the poor, having eaten and wasted the Lord's property, ran off. Nobody knew where to. A voluntary campaigning did not produce the desired results. Applications for joining the collective farm were submitted only by some small land peasants who had nothing to lose, as well as several owners who were losers. Then, at the behest of the superiors, the dispossession began. Some landlords and their families were sent by police to the station in convoys and then to the north in echelons. Others were simply kicked out of their houses, having previously been burgled. According to the former chairman of the village council, Pavlo Yosipovich Solonucha, in total about 60 families were repressed, 1 in 4. There were 236 houses in the village at that time. The first to be overtaken by this black misfortune was Ivan Terentievich Padalka, Присяжный, or Gomin. He lived near the lake. He had 40 acres of land and a large farm, 2 pairs of horses, oxen, cows, sheep. He had his own threshing machine, which people also hired from him. He cultivated the land with his wife, adult son, and 2 unmarried daughters. They worked day and night, but in the summer they didn't have enough hands. They had to hire 2 or 3 workers from outside. So, by the standards of that time, he was a kulak, although he paid the workers not 100 grams of grain per day, like Stalin, but a box, which was 10-14 kilograms, depending on the work and the agreement. And he also fed them from his table. Village activists, led by policemen and district officials, swooped in, requisitioned all the goods, and took the family to Solovki. After that, they were never heard of again. In the yard remained a good house divided into 2 halves, 2 sheds, 2 storerooms, a hut. That is why our Zawazir collective farm was founded there. At the same time, the following landlords were dispossessed. 1. Yevdokim Terentievich Padalka, brother of Ivan Prisyazhny. He had 15 or 20 acres of land, but he had served in the Zemstvo before the revolution. That was enough to get him into the enemy element. He was also taken away, and the head of the village council took his house for himself or bought it from a collective farm for nothing. 2. Pavlo Padalka Plaskinchin. He also had up to 20 acres of land and was a good landlord. He was taken away with his family, and the village council took his house. 3. Dmitro Padalka Plaskinchin was Pavel's brother. He had built a new house during the NEP, from which he was kicked out and sent to Solovki, where the family died, and the house became a village club. 4. Grigory Padalka Tereshkivsky was also a rich man. He had more than 10 acres of land and was said to be a kulak. He was exported to Solovki. The house was bought by an activist. 5. Roman Padalka Tereshkivsky was Grigory's brother. The family was taken to Solovki and no one returned. During the NEP, he had built a new house in the groves. It became a collective farm patronage. 6. Prokip Padalka, Ulязhenko, lived opposite the Zarazoms. He had a good house covered with an iron roof. The family was taken to Solovkia, and the new head of the village council took the house for himself as an apartment. 7. Mikita Padalka, Khirivsky, lived behind Petro Shish. The family was taken away. No one came back, and the new house was bought by an activist. 8. Alexei Ivanovich Padalka, Romanenko. This was a middle peasant, but he did not go to the collective farm and he was kicked out of the house. A village medical center was opened there. Alexei was on the battlefield, returned to the village and worked as a blacksmith on a collective farm. He built a new house because the old one was not returned, even though he had fought at war. 9. Sergei Loboda. He had up to 20 acres of land. The family left the house in time and fled the village. Different people lived in the house. The last one was a war invalid, Mikhailo Tkachenko Blatkiv. 10. Ivan Momit. He was dispossessed. His house was bought by a village activist. After the war, Alexander Ivanovich Momit, son of Ivan, returned as an invalid. He started working on a collective farm, but his house was not returned. They gave him another one, but in the 60s. He lived temporarily in the Sliva's house. 11. Ivan Zagalev Pavlenko was a middle-class peasant who was kicked out of his house. His sons Yevdokim and Mitrofan left for Donbass and in 1945 returned to their house. Mitrofan was already a member of the party. They were questioned but not expelled from the house. 12. Yakov Mikitovich Pavlenko, Sheshenko, was my grandfather's cousin. He had up to 20 acres of land, and he had one son, so the land was not divided, and he ended up as the kulak. He ran away from home to his married daughters. His son Grigory left for Kerch, fought on the battlefield, had orders and medals. He returned to his house, but he was forced to leave it. Then he built a new house in Lochvitse. 13. Prokip Mikitovich Pavlenko, Sheshenko, was Yakov's brother. This one was a middle peasant because he had divided the land between his married sons, Mykola and Fedosy. However, he did not go to the collective farm, and he was kicked out of the house, and all livestock and property were taken away. He died during the famine. 14. Mykola Prokopovich Pavlenko was Prokip's son. He lived behind the Tsarina, built a new house on his land from which he was expelled. He left for the Stalinska sugar factory and died there. Teacher Teslenko Yarema Yuchimovich first lived in his house, and after the war it housed a medical center and the apartment of Nastya Grigorivna Vinogradchaya. 15. Fedos Prokopovich Pavlenko, Sheshenko, was the second Prokip's son. He lived on a farm behind the Tsarina. He was also picked on and kicked out of the house. He worked at a sugar factory and lived with his parents in Brissy. He built a nice house there, died on the battlefield. And his wife, Katerina, worked on a collective farm and became the first in the region to top the 3,000 milk yield per cow. She was awarded the Order of Lenin. Apparently, the KGB did not find out that she was from a dispossessed family in Yashniki. At that time, all candidates were first passed through the KGB. The collective farm sold their house in Yashniki to Mykola Sinichenko. 16. Yevdokim Ivanovich Pavlenko, Sheshenko, was my grandfather's brother, who lived in Odessa and died of hunger. The house became his son Ivan's, but he was taken by the Black Voronok in 1937, and the head of the village council took the house. 17. Ivan Migal Philemon was an uprooted middle peasant who was deported with his family and no one returned. 18. Antin Migal Philemon was a middle peasant who was dispossessed and deported to Solovki. No one came back. His new house under the iron roof was bought by Fedor Pogulyai, the son-in-law of the head of the village council, Kuzma Solonucha. And after the war, I bought that house from Fedor, and having lived in it for 14 years, I sold it to attract a driver Babenko and his wife Tatiana Mykolaievna, a village teacher. 19. Ivan Halivets, Ivanyusha, was dispossessed and kicked out of the house. He and his wife died of starvation, and his son Yakiv and two daughters, Ulyana and Sanka, left the village. 20. Sergei Melnik was dispossessed and kicked out of the house. He died of hunger. There was a collective farm chicken coop in his house. 21. Ivan Panasenko, Badan, was an uprooted middle peasant. He lived near the Koniskis. His house was moved by the collective farm to Rogozyana. 22. Vasil Yurchenko, Stovpets, was a repressed and short middle peasant. The family was taken out and no one came back. He had not wanted to go to the collective farm and resisted the activists, threatening them with the gun. He fled into the forest, but was arrested and sentenced to be shot. 23. Savka Nuzhny was the son-in-law of Dyachenko Vasil Nabyvailo. The distraught father-in-law died at the same time. His heart could not take it. 24. Ivan Solonucha Yovenko lived opposite the Prokhorenkos. He was dispossessed and taken away. During the occupation, his elderly wife returned. In her house and yard, there was a collective farm piggery. 25. Victor Lakhno was a priest. He had 30 acres of land and a small oak forest near Zelenkiv area at the end of Yarki to the right. He himself left the village early, as soon as the church was closed. In his house, behind the church, there was a school, then an office of the collective farm, and now there is a library. 26. Varda, name, lived opposite the church, had a nice house and garden, as well as up to 20 acres of land. He left everything ahead of time and left for somewhere. In his house was the office of the collective farm and later a nursery school. That was the first part of dispossessed people who had from 10 to 20 acres of land, and some of them had less. Mass repressions had their consequences. Almost all the residents of Yashniki found themselves on the collective farm.